Hey, what's up with it, guys? Welcome back to another video. This is going to be a breakdown on the top performing spec or specs, I guess, setups for Castle Nathria as it stands right now. A few weeks in here, we've gotten the first week of Mythic going, and there's one specific build with a couple variations to it that is performing the best. Now, if you saw the biggest Tyrant video that we did, it is that build, basically. So what ends up happening, I'll show up the logs here in just a second, but if we pull up our talents here, this build right here seems to be performing the best. There's a couple people running Power Siphon, but I think the vast majority of people are running Demonic Calling. You can also run Burning Rush instead of Demon Skin. No relevance to your DPS, just a preference there. But as far as Grimoire, Demonic Consumption, Summon Vile Fiend, and Demonic Strength are all the go-to builds here. Now, I will say I have tested Dreadlash a little bit, and this is actually not a bad option as it increases your Dread Bite every single time you're casting Dreadstalkers. So this does end up having a decent amount of throughput. However, pairing Demonic Strength with all your other cooldowns seems to be performing a little bit better. But if you don't want one more button to press, you could also go Dreadlash here, and the difference in performance would be pretty negligible. Now, the big thing that's cool about this setup is that people are using two different legendaries performing very well with these same talents. So what this means is you can go into the raid with this build and then just swap legendaries on certain fights, or, you know, depending on what your playstyle preference is, and be performing very well with two pretty different playstyles for running the exact same talents. Now, let's go ahead and pull up the logs here real quick and let me show you exactly what I'm talking about. Now, we'll just look at these first few fights. I think some of these other later logs are kind of being a little bit buggy for Demonology specifically. But if you look at these logs, we have some of the top performers straight out of China using our on-use health trinket as their go-to trinket and pairing that with Wilfred's. Now, this guy here is the top performer on all these fights, and he's using the setup that we used in the biggest Tyrant video. There's also someone else in China using the same setup. Now, one thing worth mentioning here is he's using this Soul-Letting Ruby, which is out of Theater of Pain. Now, I don't have this trinket yet, and I didn't even really know it existed, but this makes sense. It's also a 2-minute cooldown, giving you a massive boost to your crit chance for 16 seconds when you use it. So this basically would fit the same when we were doing the build, and we did it. We were using Awakener's Frond, which is, I believe, a quest reward, and I think I got kind of lucky with it boosting eye level, but this is a 2-minute on-use cooldown. Same idea, though. You compare the other on-use trinket, they're kind of the same thing. Any kind of strong 2-minute on-use trinket is going to be very, very good. Now, you can see here, if you look at the talents, basically everyone's running the same talents. You got one guy running Power Siphon and Inner Demons. Okay, that's an option, kind of. You have someone else down here using Soul Conduit. So there is a little bit of variation, but you can see the vast majority of people are using Demonic Strength, Demonic Calling, Grimoire Felguard, Vile Fiend, and Demonic Consumption. One guy here using Soul Strike, another guy using Soul Strike, but you can see the majority of people are all running the same thing. Now, what gets pretty interesting is that the spread of covenants is actually, you know, relatively good. You can see on some of these fights, it's not like super dominated where every single person is running the exact same covenant. I think this little icon here is Night Fae. It's not letting me show. It doesn't really look like Night Fae, but I'm guessing that is because these other ones look not like Night Fae. So I think Night Fae is doing well. Yeah, it is. And there's Grove, Invigoration. But you can see all these, there are good performers, top-ish performers with all of these different covenants as well. So it shouldn't be a big deal whichever covenant you picked. Now, one thing I will mention is that we're running Necrolord. So we have this Fleshcraft Soulbind ability set up. So if you're not running Necro, you have Grove Invigoration, which I think does like a similar thing, but it's kind of just a proc. I haven't played Night Fae, so I don't know that for sure. But for all intents and purposes, any of the Covenant abilities I'm talking about, you can kind of interchange with your own Covenant abilities, where I'm using Fleshcraft as for the HP boost that's in our Soulbind tree, and I'm using Decimating Bolt for the Intellect boost, which is also in the Soulbind tree. If you don't have those aspects associated with some other Covenant abilities depending on your Covenant, don't worry about it. You can just basically take those out of the equation and basically do the exact same rotation. Now, the thing that's cool with these two builds is one of them is running Wilfred's. You can see here, I'll pull the logs back up real quick. You can see here we have Wilfred's, Horn Nightmare, Wilfred's, Horn Nightmare, Wilfred's, Horn Nightmare. So you can see there's a little bit of variation here, which is really cool because while the top performer is Wilfred's, the fact that Horn Nightmare is very close and in these top 10, parses is very reassuring. So it is a viable option. If you really prefer one player style over the other, I would go ahead and pick that. And the thing that's great is you could actually change this up between fights if certain fights cater more to a minute-ish cooldown window versus a 2-minute-ish cooldown window. So you can kind of make that kind of up to you and make that change on the fly while you're in the raid without having to switch up your talents or your play style too much. Now what I'm going to do is go over the two separate rotations, I guess, from a rating perspective as it relates to these builds, because we had talked about how this burst kind of worked in concept in the Biggest Tyrant video, but I've kind of perfected this rotation and how we kind of weave back in to the 2-minute burst windows. So let's go ahead and start with that. We're going to go ahead and start with is if we're using Horn Nightmare. I would say this is the easier of the two, as when you're running Wilfred's, the cooldown of your Tyrant is going to be changing, and it's going to require you to be a little bit more aware, and it's going to require you to think a little more on the fly, whereas this one is pretty cut and dry. Now, just to recap real quick, basically what we end up doing is macroing our Fleshcraft, giving us that 5% bonus. Oh, I should talk about one other thing real quick, is our Soulbinds. Our conduits. Everyone is using the Born of Blood conduit. The vast majority of people. I think this is the best for a raid scenario, so that is the conduit that I would say is going to perform the best with these consistently. But we're going to be using Fleshcraft to get this 5% bonus health for 30 seconds as our opener. This is macroed in with our on-use health trinket. Then we're going to get hardcast 1 Demon Bolt. Then we're going to go Grimoire Felguard. The image isn't showing up here for some reason, but Grimoire Felguard into Vile Fiend into Dreadstalkers. And then we're going to build up to 5 shards. We're going to cast Hand of Gul'dan twice. We're going to cast Tyrant. Then we're going to cast Decimating Bolt and Demonic Strength. And we're going to be able to use our things like Blood Fury, Awakener's Font, any like 2-minute cooldown type situations you have offensively will be off of cooldown because this 20 seconds has run out. Now, originally, one thing that I thought was going to be kind of problematic with this build or this setup was that your Grimoire Felguard's 2 minutes and your Tyrant's 1.5 minutes, and you're going to be waiting 30 seconds all the time. But what ends up happening is that your Grimoire Felguard lasts for 17 seconds. You basically are trying to cast your Tyrant right before Grimoire Felguard runs out. So what ends up happening is you're really only waiting about 15 seconds once your Tyrant comes back around. So it actually doesn't feel that bad as far as what you're waiting for. It synergizes actually a lot better than I initially thought it was going to once I've kind of gotten the rotation and the play style down. Now, the last thing to mention is that in between these 2-minute windows where you're basically watching the cooldown of your Fleshcraft to then reopen back everything else, you have the time to fit in 1 Vile Fiend and 1 Decimating Bolt. What I'm usually doing, Vile Fiend will be up before your Decimating Bolt, but I've been holding Vile Fiend to then cast Decimating Bolt, then Vile Fiend, and then try and pair a Dreadstalkers in that cast as well, following my Decimating Bolt because of that intellect buff that we are getting from the Decimating Bolt. Since you're only getting 1 Vile Fiend in between those 2-minute windows, it doesn't make sense to cast it earlier without the intellect buff. This is a little bit nitpicky here, but these are kind of little ways you can kind of squeeze out as much DPS as possible. So you'll see I wait until Decimating Bolt comes back off of cooldown, and then I cast Vile Fiend and ideally try and squeeze in a Dreadstalker cast after that while I still have that intellect buff rolling. Now, last thing to mention is I actually have not been casting Demonic Strength in between these windows because it can get a little bit tight if you mistime it at all. So I've just been kind of holding it, but you definitely could, I'd say if you get more and more comfortable with this build, be able to cast a Demonic Strength in between each of those windows as it's only a 1-minute cooldown. So let's go ahead and get into it here, okay? So I'm going to cast 1 global of my Fleshcraft. I'm going to cast Hardcast Demon Bolt. This is approximately a 5-second opener, so you could time that with a pull timer. You see, then we're going to go Vile Fiend into Dreadstalkers. I'm going to build up here to 5 shards. 3, 4, 5. Then we're going to Hand of Gul'dan, Tyrant, straight into Decimating Bolt here. And then I'm going to go into Demonic Strength. And then we're going to go Hand of Gul'dan. And then we're just doing a normal rotation here. Now you can see my DPS here on the right is going to spike pretty crazy. You also want to be ready to cast that Dreadstalkers right away when it comes up off cooldown, as you have a pretty high int buff usually at that point between your Blood Fury, your on-use trinkets, and your int buff from your Decimating Bolts. Now you also need to be ready here when your Dreadstalkers are all about to fall off. You're going to get a bunch of demonic core procs, so you need to be ready to spend those as soon as they start coming up. You want to be casting Dreadstalkers on cooldown. Vile Fiend just came up, and we're going to hold that for another 10 seconds until Decimating Bolt is back up. Now, building back into this rotation, what you want to basically do is go into your Fleshcraft cast with 3 shards. Okay, we're going to cast Vile Fiend into Dreadstalkers here while we have that int buff back up. And then ideally you want to get any kind of Hand of Gul'dans or anything that you can during that window as well. But it's just, again, that's a little bit min-maxy. It's not really make or break. I wouldn't worry about it too much. But in a perfect world, try and pair it up off of the back of Decimating Bolt, or if you have any kind of Covenant abilities that are giving you a temporary intellect boost, it's very strong. Now going into this, we have 20 seconds till we have Fleshcraft coming back up. We want to basically be at 3 shards again when Fleshcraft comes up. Then we're going to hard cast 2 Shadow Bolts to get to 5 shards and basically go into the same rotation that we just did in the last opener. You see our Tyrant just came back up. I'm going to actually hold Dreadstalkers here. I'm going to cast 1 more Shadow Bolt, Fleshcraft. Then we're going to go again. Shadow Bolt, Tyrant's back up, Vile Fiend, Dreadstalkers. I'm going to actually use my Demonic Core procs here and try and squeeze out a couple more Hand of Gul'dans, and then we'll go into Tyrant here, and you see our Gladiator is just falling off, and then we're going to go ahead and use Demonic Strength here. So that's kind of how you do it. And you just go back into the rotation like that. Again, going into that 2-minute window, once your Fleshcraft or your 2-minute trinket is back up off cooldown, your health trinket, you want to have 3 shards, cast the trinket, then hard cast 2 Shadow Bolts, because it's all about the timing with this. 2 Shadow Bolts to get up to 5 shards, then go back into your Grimoire Felguard, and you rinse and repeat this whole process, okay? You see right now, no Flask, no Bloodlust, no Potions, anything. We're maintaining around 3.5k DPS, with our eye level being 198, right? This is a very good setup. I have really enjoyed this playstyle a lot. I think this is actually the setup I'm probably going to lean towards, because playing around those 2-minute windows feels very clean, and everything kind of feels in sync. Wilfred's can be a little bit messier just because the timing of Wilfred's can change. So let's swap this out and I'll show you guys. Basically what you're doing is there's a couple things that change. Overall idea is the same when it comes to the 2-minute windows. You're saving your Grimoire Felguard, your Fleshcraft or 2-minute health trinket. The 2-minute things you're basically using every other Tyrant. You end up having to hold these though for a pretty substantial amount of time, because you can't get Tyrant down to less than a minute cooldown. So you're always kind of holding these for a little while, which feels a little bit bad to me. But again, the top performers seem to be doing this, and this seems to be performing slightly better than the kind of 2-minute setup running Horn Nightmare. But you want to end up holding Decimating Bolt and Summon Vile Fiend for your Tyrant. We'll also be able to use Demonic Strength with every Tyrant because of the timing of all of this stuff. So in a perfect world, we're pairing up as many Hand of Gul'dan imps as we can. We're saving our Vile Fiend for every Tyrant, and then we have Grimoire and Fleshcraft and the big kind of burst setup every other Tyrant. So we'll go ahead and I'll show you. You're going to do the same 2-minute opener. We'll go ahead and go into it here. Hardcast Demon Bolt. Again, this is a 5-second countdown if you're doing like a pull timer in a raid. And we'll go in the same setup here. And I highly recommend you guys kind of practice this to get the timing down, because it does take a little while to get used to this. Decimating Bolt into Demonic Strength, into all of our on-use trinkets. Now here the goal is to basically spend our shards as fast as we can. We want to really make sure we're maximizing our shard gain and our shard spending, being really aware of our Demonic Core procs, and being really aware of how many shards we're spending and the timing of our Tyrant coming back off cooldown. It's very important that you don't want to cap on shards here at all, because when you're using Wilfred, you really want to prioritize all that shard generation and shard spending. Now I'm holding Vile Fiend here. Now you can see how long we end up holding Vile Fiend for about 30 seconds. So that's what I'm saying. This feels a little bit less synergistic because we end up having to hold some of these for a long time. Again, I do think it is probably going to perform slightly better, but if you're not a fan of having to hold cooldowns, you know, then it might not be the playstyle for you. So I'm going to go into Vile Fiend right here. I'm going to cast 2 more. We're going to go Vile Fiend into Hand of Gul'dan. I'm going to wait for my Dreadstalkers to come back up here. We're going to end up wasting this 1 shard, but we're going to go straight into Tyrant, into Decimating Bolt, into Demonic Strength. And then we're going to go back through our rotation again. Now we have about, you can see about 30-ish seconds on our Grimoire, our Fleshcraft. So we end up being a little bit ahead, but in a perfect world, if you're pairing this with Bloodlust, or maybe you have a little bit more haste and you can spend shards a little bit faster, then this might actually be a little bit more optimal. So we'll go again here. And again, now you see our Fleshcrafts come back up off cooldown. We have about 45 seconds, but by the time we get to spending all of our shards, it'll be about 30 seconds we'll be having to wait here. I'm going to go ahead and pop Dreadstalkers again. So that'll be back up for this next kind of opener here. And we'll go back through the same setup. Got 20 seconds here. We'll do the same thing. We want to basically build back up to 3 shards as our goal going into this next Fleshcraft window. So I'm going to cast 1, 2, and we're going to go Fleshcraft, Shadowbolt, Tyrant, Vile Fiend, Dreadstalkers, Shadowbolt up to 5, Double Hand of Gul'dan, back into Tyrant, Decimating Bolt, Demonic Strength, and then we're going to go back into the same rotation. So you guys can see for me, these builds perform very similarly. See, we're right around that 3.4K, 3.5K kind of number. There's not a huge difference between these from a performance perspective. So again, if you really like one of these legendaries, that's the question I've gotten the most regarding legendaries is like Wilfred's versus Demonic Synergy versus Horn Nightmare. Like, which one's better? All of these are, I mean, not all of them, but these two are performing very similarly when we're talking about this specific build. So again, we can use the same talents, basically the same rotation, and the only thing you're really tailoring is the Vile Fiend and your Decimating Bolt cast to pair with all your cooldowns. If you're running Wilfred's, you get to use your Vile Fiend and your Decimating Bolt basically always with your Tyrant. If you're using the 2-minute cooldown, you can use it one time in between. Again, the overall DPS performance of these should be relatively negligible, so pick which one you enjoy the most. But these are the 2 top performing builds. Hopefully this helps you guys kind of understand the flow of more than just the opener and how you kind of play back into that big burst, being able to sustain that DPS over these longer fights. This is the build I am going to be running and playing this week in Raid, so if you are curious to see it in action, hit that sub button and come and check out any of the streams. We're going to be streaming Tuesday and Thursday, I believe, this week. And yeah, hopefully you guys found this helpful. Like always, hit me with any questions down below in the comments if you have them, and I'll do my best to answer them. I try really hard to answer every single question, so if there's something I left out or I forgot to mention, by all means, please ask me down below and I'll do my best to get back to you. Or like I said, hop by and check out the streams because that's an easier way to me to have some kind of longer form discussion with you guys rather than just talking in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.